to do if you're going to have a hot spring, you really have to be focused on your winter, and that's really what this is all about, is bringing a sense of focus to your winter training. So many cyclists that I know, even those who have raced more than 2 or 3 seasons, basically just sort of ride when they want to ride and go out and do some hard intervals now and then. And without that focus, they kind of wonder why they aren't really doing any better when they get into their spring season. So what I want to talk about first off is, who is this webinar really for? What we're looking at here is any racer or wannabe racer that can enjoy seeing themselves progress towards a specific performance goal. And there's a lot of key words in there. If you're watching this just as what I call a fast recreational cyclist, a cyclist who enjoys going out for spirited rides but really doesn't have any intention of racing, then we're going to be talking about a lot of concepts that aren't going to be so exciting to you. If you are desirous of racing, or if you've raced for a season or 3, and you want to see yourself progress, the word enjoy is all red there because you really have to enjoy the aspect of training. And by training, I'm talking about setting a baseline and then setting a goal from that baseline to actually see yourself progress towards a specific goal. And that specific goal is really, really important. If you don't have a specific goal to work towards, then it's like if you're a pilot, you can't get from one place to another unless you've got what they call a vector. How do you know where you're going unless you know exactly where you are? So I'm going to actually stop at this point now that we've got a number of folks who've popped in, and just ask real quick if you can send me a chat over on the left-hand side of your screen, and just let me know if you're actually hearing the broadcast. If technically everything is coming across, just send me a note, please. Awesome. Very good. All right, we'll jump back into the broadcast. All right, so a little bit about me. I've been a committed cyclist ever since 1985. The very first purchase I ever made with my very first paycheck from my very first job was a road race bike. And I've ridden and trained with racers of all categories literally ever since. And by all categories, I should really say all disciplines. That even includes a number of triathletes. But my first season of road racing was abysmal. I abandoned half of the rides, just dejected that I couldn't keep up. I was utterly and totally dropped until I started getting serious about setting goals, looking into the mental game, understanding how you fuel yourself, doing appropriate strength training, making sure that my bike fit me properly. My bike fit was off so bad, couldn't get comfortable on the bike in that first season. Strategy and more. Once I became a student of racing, then things really changed. In my second season, I finished 7th in my state's Category 5 Spring Series. So I go from not being able to complete the races in the season to actually being a real competitor. My background is in information distillation. I've spent 15 of my 30 years in marketing communications working in the healthcare, education, and marketing field, taking really complicated stuff and distilling it down so that it's nice and easy to understand. So I'm now bringing that to cycling. And I'm an accredited USA cycling coach. I'm presently a level 2 coach. And if you're not familiar with the level designations, a beginner coach is level 3, intermediate is 2, and then elite coaches are level 1. Well, I have to give you the obligatory disclaimer because as a coach with a coaching business and broadcasting like this to the world, you just have to state that cycling is really it's a seriously challenging sport, and as such, it can be quite dangerous. So you have to be aware that there are risks. You have to have a plan to minimize the likelihood of that happening. And what I'm talking about there is making sure that your core strength is appropriate, making sure that you have the right type of skills training, understand what it's like to ride in a pack and practice riding in a pack, practice taking high-speed descents. and to have a plan for when the nasties happen, because the likelihood of them happening is fairly high. You're cruising along at a high rate of speed with 2 square inches or so of contact patch, and all of you are fighting for the same bit of real estate, that inside line on that corner, or that white line across the finish line. So when that does happen, you need a plan for that. You need to have your insurance paid up. You need to make sure that you've got a kit in your car, or that someone on your team, if you're with the team, is responsible for carrying the bandages and the alcohol, etc., so that you're able to take care of that. So the user, and that's you, is therefore responsible with whatever information I'm sharing with you here. If you decide to pick up and run with it, fantastic. Welcome to the competitive world of cycling. But all of your successes and all of your challenges are absolutely 100% yours. All right, so at the start for winter, what do you need? Even in winter preparation, it all begins with a goal. I raced the last couple of seasons with a cohort who always used to like to say, hey man, every race is an A race. Well, no, every race can't be an A race, and you can't constantly drive yourself into the ground, because you need recovery. And so once you've got a goal and you can work back, you can then progress through your winter, on through the rest of your training towards that goal. So what you see on the screen right now is a very simplified understanding of periodization. From understanding what your FTP, or your functional threshold power is, or your lactate threshold heart rate. If you don't have a power meter, you should have a heart rate monitor. And with either of those, to do an appropriate baseline test, you can then get into a proper winter of ramping up, start your build and what I call racecraft, which is when you get into actually doing training that starts to mimic the demands of your A race, tapering down and then having that actual race. So what we're going to be talking about today is just that ramp up period. But in order to build your ramp up and to have a successful winter, it starts with identifying your first A race. What is your goal event? Because the event characteristics, I'm talking about what level are we talking? Category 5 or Category 4? So we have an understanding of speed. We have an understanding of the length of that particular race. We know, is it a technical course? Is it a hill climbing course? Are you going to be spending a lot of time heading into the wind? Those event characteristics, plus an understanding of your strengths and your limiters, and if you're unfamiliar with the term limiters, we'll talk about that in a moment, will define what your training is going to be. And the nature of that training, the race-like mimicry that happens later in the training season, that defines what you're going to be doing in the winter. So winter prep preps you for that hard stuff to build your limiters later. So what was I talking about? We all have our natural strengths, and we should know what our natural weaknesses are. Limiters are those weaknesses that are going to hold you back if they are determiners for a race success. So this is what I'm talking about. Let's say your strength is time trialing. You don't have any problem in holding a significant level of power for a really long time, 15K, 20K, even in the 40K. But when it comes to weaknesses, you've got a horrible sprint, and when it comes to climbing, you're constantly one of the last ones up the hill. Well, when we look at your A race, if your A race is one that has a significant climb or a couple of significant climbs where you know that that's where the race selection is going to happen, that's where the race success will turn, then your limiter, well, here I am talking about the climbing. I meant to say, if it's a flat, long, flat finish, and you know it's going to end in a sprint, then between those two weaknesses, sprinting becomes your limiter. So what I'm saying here is, in that A race, look at the characteristic of the race where the selection is going to happen. And if your weakness falls there, that is the limiter. So you're going to want to prepare throughout your winter to build on sprinting in the later part of your season, in your build phase. All right, so working backwards, establishing how hard or actually how easy that you're going to prep. I say how easy because too many cyclists during their ramp-up phase, during their winter, bury themselves and they become what Joe Friel calls December stars or January stars. They peak way too soon. You don't want that to happen. So by understanding what we just talked about, where your strengths are and where your weaknesses are, and then where that A race determiner is, take the weakness that's going to be most taxed in that race and that becomes the limiter. That's what you're going to be prepping on. So you can begin to warm up your limiters without ignoring your strengths. So in that previous slide, your strengths, time trialing, and then because that A race has a drag race finish, and you know that the sprinters are going to end up fighting it out, you want to work on the sprinting and prepare during your winter for what it's going to take to work on sprinting several weeks later. But you don't want to ignore the fact that you're already good at time trialing. We'll talk about that as we go on. The ramp up is divided into two phases, prep versus base. Now, prep period, if you've had little to no exercise structure in the previous 3 months, then you're going to need to do some prep. If you're like a lot of Category 5 racers or people who have never raced, but you're looking to the spring to start racing, then you've probably laid off since July, August. You haven't really done anything. If you raced a little bit or dabbled with it, you hung up the bike or just went out for some fun rides. And if that's true, then you're going to have to do what I call prepping. If you don't understand that, it's unstructured. It's simply getting the muscles moving. It's being active, but not necessarily on the bike. In fact, I encourage you, if you've been off the bike over the last couple of months, don't immediately jump onto it and make the bike a focus of your training. There are other things you probably want to be doing. We'll look at a list of that in a slide or two. And then you go into your base period. That's structured. It's time-based. You've got time goals and some power or heart rate goals, and it's mostly on the bike. So for prep, I say 0 to 4 because that depends on what happened last season or the last 3 months. If you have been consistently active, then you may not need a prep. You may go directly into base. But if you have been laying off, then going for long walks or mountain biking are fantastic things to do for the first couple to 4 weeks. Using your bike as a primary commuting vehicle. Getting regularly involved with friends with basketball, racquetball, other indoor types of sports. Martial arts or yoga. I studied martial arts for 12 years and I still do some forms to keep myself flexible and supple. If you are absolutely dedicated to just throwing yourself at the road bike, then that's fine. Just don't start doing anything that is structured. Don't start thinking I got to do intervals today or I've got to do X number of miles today. Just ride. Just enjoy the bike and get familiar with the bike again. So this brings up the question of time. How much time do we want to be devoting to our prep and our base period? Well, it kind of gets down to how much time you can realistically devote to structured training in a week. So when you look at a week with your family commitments, your work commitments, the time that you can actually get up and train or come home and do your training, lump all that together. But one of the simpler ways that I look at it, if you're what I call a never racer, you've never raced before, you want to be a racer, or you've raced for 1 or 2 seasons, I've learned through coaching others and my own personal experience that real success and being able to track your own personal progress kind of hinges around 8 hours a week minimum. Now that's including long rides on the weekend. And those longer rides on the weekends should be as long as your goal event. So a lot of Category 5 rides or races are in that 1.5 to 2 hour mode. Get up to Category 4 and you're pushing 3 hours, maybe a little bit more. Well, that's how long you want your long rides to be on the weekends during base. So if you've got, let's say, 2.5 hours on a Saturday and 3 hours on a Sunday, there's 5.5 hours out of a recommended 8. All right, so 2.5, 3.5 hours through the rest of the week. We're not talking about a lot of time during the week. All right, let's go back into our situation here. We talked about prep, which is really just activity that is regular for a period of time, 8 hours a week or so, unstructured. Once you move into your base period, 6 to 10 weeks, to try to build what I call an efficiency plateau. During your bike rides, you're looking to maintain around zone 2 to zone 2.5. And if you're not familiar with the zone system, it's a little bit outside of the level of detail I wanted to get into in this webinar, but it's where you do a functional threshold test, or you go to a lab. Many sports labs will conduct for you a blood-borne finger prick test that will give you your lactic threshold heart rate. Once you know what your functional threshold power is, once you know what your lactic threshold heart rate is, you can then calculate your training zones or power zones. And zone 2 to 2.5, light to moderate effort. But a lot of people talk about long, slow distance. It isn't slow. As a matter of fact, triathletes work to build a lot of power at the 2.5 to 3 zone. It's about the long and steady, really, even and consistent. So if you're out on those weekend rides of between 2 and 3 hours or so as a Category 5 or a Category 4 racer, you are trying to really keep yourself in that. For me, the goal is an average of 2.5. Nice and even, no big spikes. Don't be spending 15 minutes at threshold 3.5 or zone 4, because you're trying to build aerobic endurance here. The ability for your oxygen processing system to consistently fuel your muscles, and that takes time, and it takes an even level of muscular stress. So what you're looking for here is you're building something that, if you're familiar with Training Peaks, is called the efficiency factor, and your goal is to plateau. And so the best way for me to talk about that is to actually show you an example of a ride from one of my athletes. So this was a short ride, relatively short in terms of Category 5, an hour and a half or so. And if you look over there on the right-hand side, highlighted in yellow, you see NP for normalized power, 171 watts. Look to the upper left. This person's functional threshold power is 256 watts. And you want them to be at zone 2, which is in between 56 to 76% of that FTP. That's 141 to 192 watts. So the normalized power, which is a little more, it's a better way of looking at it than an average, was right down the middle at 171. That's exactly where I want this athlete to be for this particular type of training at this particular time in the season. Now look over on the right-hand side. The intensity factor 0.71, like I said, a little bit on the high side. 76% is the high end of zone 2, but that's fine, right in the ballpark. Forget about VI, that's variability index. What I want you to see, though, is the efficiency factor, 1.4. The efficiency factor is how the power and the heart rate track together. So what you're going to find out, and by the way, if you don't have a power meter, there's still ways of tracking this. We'll get at that in a moment. What you're looking for here is a consistency. And as I explain this, I actually want to back out and go to video so I can actually talk to you guys face to face about this one. Stop screen sharing and show the picture. Hi guys, for the first time in the video, I'm actually talking to you straight up here. So what you're doing here for your base rides, especially for those long rides during the weekends, is you're trying to build a efficiency factor that gets higher and higher and higher and higher, and then at one point it begins to plateau. And so what you're going to do is, and you can do it on the trainer, you can do it on the road, you can alternate, as I do, between trainer and road. But what you're trying to really do here is do this by time, not by distance. So let's say 2.5 is the time that most of your races are probably going to take. And that becomes your long rides out on the weekend. 2.5 hours on the trainer is difficult, but it's something that I encourage you to get into the habit of doing at this particular phase. You're not going to be doing these after you plateau. But so 2.5 hours in that zone 2, 2.5 sweet spot. And if you have a power meter, then you're going to be looking at that efficiency factor. At the beginning of the season, when you do them, they're going to be quite low, 1.1, 1.2, 1.28. But as you continue to do the same route on the weekend, or the same couple of routes for the same amount of time, where you spend that time down on the trainer, what you're going to see week after week after week is that tracking your heart rate and your power, at first they're going to be very separate. You're going to be struggling to maintain a consistent power, but your heart rate is going to get higher throughout the that 2.5 hours as you get tired. Or you're going to find that you're having a hard time maintaining the power, and your heart rate may stay pretty consistent. And that separation, that vector, shows that you don't have the aerobic foundation that you need to go in and start doing the hard intervals that you so desperately want to do as a cyclist. And I know this because of the athletes that I train, and every coach that I talk to talks about the challenge of keeping athletes, cyclists, road racers at this time of the year consistent and even, just calm the heck down, right? So that efficiency factor, as it grows and grows to 1.4, 1.5, 1.6, at some point it's going to start fluctuating. 3, 4, 5 weeks in, you know, you've got a 1.6, a 1.58, a 1.62. That's when you've plateaued. That means you are aerobically fit at that length of time. All right, so enough about power. What if you don't have a power meter? I'm actually now getting into places where I'm going to switch back to the screen share, so you'll understand what I'm getting at here. Entire screen and share, and let's play here. All right, same long ride over a period of weekends, as I mentioned. Same target intensity, zone 2 with watts or heart rate. So no power meter, that's fine. What you want to do is record your average speed at the same heart rate. So what you're doing as you're out on the road or down on your trainer for that length of time is ride to heart rate. Ride to that target of zone 2 to 2.5 consistently as you can for the length of time. And then what you're going to be doing is looking at your average speed over that 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 weeks. And you should find that you're getting a little faster over time, and then you're going to start to plateau with your speed. All right, so once you have plateaued, then your aerobic base is pretty much there. And you then will start going into areas where we're not going to go with this webinar, but I have to give you a little bit of a plug. Build one, what I call racecraft. There's a period of time where you're really doing structured workouts that are designed to mimic the event that you're going into and to exceed them. Those are very, very hard workouts before you taper off. During that period of time, this is your sales pitch for the seminar, and I want to keep this brief. If you want to do it alone, I do have a product called 3x25. It's a 25-minute video that is structured, help you plan 25 weeks of time to this peak or to this A race. It is completely guided, step by step, how to set your thresholds, what to do in the weight room, and I even give you stem reminders that you can cut out and tape to your stem or your top tube. It is remarkably detailed. It is not out of the box. It's not one plan for everyone. It helps you choose your A race and then helps you understand what types of intervals and workouts and winter training you should be doing so that you are absolutely peaking for that A event. 25 weeks out, that includes a prep period if you need it. If you want to be guided, I do offer individual coaching, which you can learn about if you go to Start Confident, and here you see where it's located, coaching services and plans. I do use WKO4, I do use Training Peaks. You will receive a Training Peaks account. If I am your coach, I will lay out an annual plan for you, and we will get absolutely detailed and in the weeds. And depending on which level of engagement, we can have you adjusting bi-weekly or having you adjusted by month, which means if I see that you are absolutely getting excellent with your FTP, I'm not going to wait until next month to make adjustments on your workouts. We're going to do it every couple of weeks. So we're keeping you at that bleeding edge where you need to be. All right, that's enough of the sales pitch. So laying your winter foundation on the bike, what do you have to actually do? What are the specific things you're focusing on? Event characteristics is something I mentioned early on. You have to do a little bit of research for your A race. You want to talk to other riders who have done that race. You want to go online and you want to look at Strava. You want to look at ridewithgps.com, which is one of my favorites, and find out where on that primary races course is the selection most likely to be made. And then you have to make a decision. Are you naturally strong or weak there at that particular selection point? Because from there, you're going to be making your training decisions. And here's an example. In the Cincinnati area, this was a race that I planned to peak for last year. And what you see here is a 10% grade that goes on and undulates for nearly 1.5 miles. And we have to climb that big hill 4 times at category 4, and it's at fairly high speed around the 2nd and 3rd laps. The descent gets rather harrowing, and then there is a long time trial section. So this particular race, 4 laps, not necessarily long, it's a 10.7 mile course, so at 43 miles, that's a fairly fast race for category 4. But it favors climbers who have burst ability. You know, the entire climbing section at 1.5 miles, that is not very long, but it is steep. If you've got the ability to surge on that thing, you're going to be able to make the selection. Or for time trialists who can get away and stay away. If they can hang at the climb and descend fairly well and then lay down the hurt over that long time trial section, then they're going to do really well. It's that type of event analysis that you need to work on, which leads you to this particular area here. If there's anything in my presentation that I'd say come back to, because we are going to save and post this to my YouTube channel, but you can take a screenshot here. If it's a defining climb for your A race or your primary event, then power to weight is what you've got to work on. Your winter focus is diet and gym. You want to lose the weight. You want to be as trim as you possibly can to get the power to weight ratio up. And at the gym, you want to be working on building your power. And we're going to have a section about exercises at the gym in a moment. If there's a sprint finish, you've got to build short-term explosiveness no matter what your natural build is. I'm slender, I have a climber's build, I do not have a sprint. This year's focus for me is the difficulty and the pain and suffering of working on my sprint in order to be competitive. Last season, I finished 4th because I make the break. I have the time trial that gets out there, but I'm caught at the end because I just cannot maintain it in the sprint. The winter focus for me, gym and speed work. I've got to be able to have that high cadence, and I've got to be able to build the specific power so I can blend power and speed together when it comes time for that later on during like January, early February. Long headwind sections. If you live in the Midwest, I'm a former Kansas City and I knew all about this. Anaerobic endurance and getting aero is absolutely something to focus on in the gym for this time of year, and flexibility. A little note here about bike fit and being aero. If you haven't done a bike fit, it is money well spent. I offer some bike fits for those who live in the Cincinnati area, but if you have someone that you trust, that does a professional fit, I encourage you, save your pennies, go and have that done. It will change absolutely everything. You may think you have great bike fit, but if you've never had it professionally adjusted, I really encourage you to look into that. And then again, if getting aero, if being a time trialist, or if you're in an area where there is a lot of win the battle, flexibility, yoga, learning a proper stretching routine will absolutely pay dividends. Sheer distance. If your A event is particularly long, then aerobic endurance, muscular endurance, and breakaway ability is what you've got to start building in the winter. And that means working on your functional threshold power or muscular endurance, the ability to lay out good power over a long period of time. So that's really the only one thing we're going to talk about in the next screen. If your A event, it really has to do with just a long slog, then there's other things we're going to talk about for building your FTP. So hold the show there. Technical course, bike handling skills is what you've got to work on. So for your winter focus, you want to start working on drills. You want to find that empty parking lot, and you want to get those little orange cones and start working on some very specific things. And balance and core work. Again, I could include working on core work in the gym. Also, yoga. If you've never considered it, I can say this because as a former martial artist, a Chinese form of yoga is called Qigong. So if someone in your area teaches Qigong, I would encourage you to look into that. So your on-bike base focus. Let's talk about some specific things that you can do. So I mentioned speed work, I mentioned FTP, I mentioned skill drills. What am I talking about? What do you do? In terms of speed work, you're talking about drills that help you develop a ridiculously high cadence in increasing intensity. One-leg drills are an absolute foundational practice. Nobody likes them. They're not sexy or cool, but I tell you, they work. Working on one-leg drills and form sprints should become something that in your winter training over the next 6 to 10 weeks or so should be critical. What are form sprints? Form sprints are where you find yourself a moderate hill. We're talking moderate as like 5% grade. Certainly no more than 6 to 7% grade. That takes you 5 to 8 minutes to climb. And so you climb these at a relatively comfortable effort, but the work is in coming down. And what you want to do is when you turn around to come down the hill, you're getting up into a big gear, you're out of the saddle, and then you want to sprint down the hill, down in the drops, and the form is for sprinting. It's not the power of sprinting because you're going downhill at a high cadence, 120, 130 if you can muster it. And the idea is because you are going downhill and you're down and in the drops, you're trying to maintain the core effort and position of a hard sprint. You're letting the bike work fluidly beneath you with that high cadence going down that hill, and you repeat that. Come back up the hill in a moderate to almost easy intensity. The effort with this speed work is going down the hill. If building your FTP is the focus, then I recommend sweet spot intervals. And your sweet spot is a zone of 3.8 to 4.2. And these should be intervals of increasing length. So you may start out, here it is November, we're not quite at Thanksgiving yet. If you know that your FTP needs to be higher, if you know that you need breakaway intensity or breakaway speed, or to be able to hold a breakaway for a long period of time, then I would encourage you to, once you know what your FTP is, and you can calculate those training zones, to start with sweet spot intervals that may last 3 minutes, 4 minutes, at a zone of 3.8 to 4.2, at a relatively high cadence, 90, 95. And so what you'll want to do is 4 minutes on, 4 minutes off, 4 minutes on, 4 minutes off. And you'll end up increasing that week upon week upon week. So you go from 4 minutes to 4.5 minutes to 5 minutes, up to eventually what you'll want to get to are the classic 2x20s. 20 minutes at threshold, not 3.8. You want ultimately 20 by 20 at 4.0 and higher. So this is one way of getting you to build into it during the winter months in the sweet spot, keeping them fairly short at this period of time. And skill drills. And by that, low speed slaloms, obstacle avoidance, narrow work. By narrow work, at my USA Cycling Level 2 seminar, we had to do, as coaches, narrow work on the bike, setting up little orange cones or tennis balls cut in half 14 inches apart, leading up a grade, and sprinting and climbing in this 14-inch spot, and then getting it even narrower and narrower and narrower to hold that line, to be able to go into curves at high speed in a parking lot. You're finding a curb. Now this is that part where, remember I told you about the risky part of it? You're attempting to dive crit fashion around curves, getting closer and closer to those curves. These are skill drills that you want to practice during the winter months. All right, so the big question, well, okay, Sam, you know, we're working on high speed, but it's not really high power. We're talking about sweet spot stuff. What about intervals? What about really intense intervals? I don't want to lose my edge. During the winter, I advise all of my athletes to avoid threshold work. It's simply too soon. You want to target muscular endurance for your limiter. But that doesn't mean you can't do some intensity work. What I'm saying here is you don't want a lot of it. 2 sessions a week max. I like it to be no more than sweet spot. I don't want to see people going anaerobic. I don't want to see sprint work happening during base. Why so few? Why only 2 of these sorts of work? I mean, I did a sweet spot workout before I hopped on Google+. I did a series of sweet spots on my time trial bike. But the whole thing lasted a grand total of 1 hour and 5 minutes. And the grand total of sweet spots that I did was 16 minutes of time. Why so little? 2 reasons. First, your build phase comes later, and those are going to be hard. I mean, we're talking doing sprint intervals that are all out, nothing held back for 5, 10, 15 seconds, and you're doing 30, 40, 50 of them in a workout. That comes later. You don't want to be burnt out. You don't want to become, as Joe Friel says, that December star or that January star. You're trying to build that aerobic base now. So keep your intensity at or under your threshold during this period of time. So if you are going to do those 2 intervals a week or so, what should you be doing? First, I recommend heartily that you wait until the last half of your base period to start these. Make sure that you've built that aerobic base. Make sure that you've reached that plateau that I talked about earlier before you begin this. So in terms of climbing, hill repeats at your sweet spot. Just at or under threshold. If you're working with the zone system, it's 4.0 or under. Your total work time should equal what you need for your key event. And what I mean by that is when you look at your key event for your race, let's go back to the one that I talked about where you're climbing that hill 4 times. I know from previous power files and from other people that have done that particular race, it takes roughly 6 minutes to climb that hill. So 6 minutes times 4 laps is 24 minutes of work. If you want to exceed it, add half of a climb. So 26 plus 3, and that's it. That's your total amount of work time at sweet spot. Sprinting, big gear stomps, or hill surges. And what I'm talking about there is you're on that moderate hill where you've got a big gear, 60 RPMs as you're climbing, and you're taking it, your heart rate's not going to get up. You're going to be at a fairly low or moderate heart rate as you're cruising along at 60 RPMs. But then what you want to do is get yourself into the sprinter position and for 12 revolutions, out of the saddle and give it all you've got. Your heart rate and your power doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. You're going to get out of the saddle. You're not going to shift your gear. You're going to stay in that same gear, but you're going to be stomping on the gear, and you're going to get in anywhere from 5 to 10 of those as you climb the hill. Recover on the way down and get back up into it again and climb that hill, say 3 times with those sprint stomps. You're building muscular endurance and you're building strength. So for muscular endurance focus, I recommend what I call cruise intervals. These are really great to throw into those long rides after you've built that level of efficiency that I talked about. You're out there for 2.5, 3 hours, you're riding along at 2.5, and then you can throw in 4-minute efforts right at zone 4. And you're down in the drops, and it's kind of like you're time trialing, but it's not that bleeding intensity of 4.5 to 5. It's right there when you can clear the lactate out of your system. So 4 of those at 4 minutes at zone 4 with 4 minutes in between. That's easy to remember. 4, 4, 4, and 4. And as you're doing that with your zone 2.5, you're actually building on top of the muscular effort of maintaining 2.5 or 2+ hours, but then you're throwing in that little extra level of muscular stress that you really need. You'll notice that in these intervals, I did not include anaerobic intervals, going all out for a certain period of time, zone 5 work. I didn't list technical skills. You should be working on technical skills anyway during the winter. Anaerobic, like I said, I don't really believe that you want to be doing that now. That comes later. Power comes from your core, weightlifting. So many people say, I don't want to lift weights during the winter, Sam. It's going to put bulk on me. That, my friends, is absolutely a fallacy. Or if you're working with weights that are that intense to build bulk, you're doing something wrong. Working out in the gym probably isn't going to make you faster, but it's going to give you some other very, very specific benefits. Yours truly here, these are outtakes from information that I give you in the 3x25 plan. Not necessarily speed, but what you get is core strength, which supports endurance and it supports recovery. I started getting the best time trial times of my life after I started really focusing on core, because you're able to hold yourself in the position on the bike so much more effortlessly. Your efficiency really goes up. It means you're going to be more resilient. If you have a crash, you're going to respond better. You're probably going to recover faster after a mishap. You're going to get stronger, and if you're working on the proper form and the proper exercises, you're going to get stronger, not bulkier, because you're only going to be working on cycling specific muscles. I don't want to see you doing preacher curls, for example. That's a muscle isolation exercise that doesn't work cycling specific muscles. You only want to be working on muscles that work the body in the cycling position. Finally, for women in the audience and those that are over 40, I recommend that you do weight work throughout the season. During prep and during base, you want to be hitting the gym twice a week. And then once your race season starts, back it off to once a week. But it should be year-round if you're female or over 40. And the reasons for that: bone density, calcium loss. You want to see an easy progression. I'm going to work through this pretty quickly here. Determine your 1 rep max in the gym. And if you don't know what that is, I show you how to do that in 3x25. The specific method to determine what is the maximum amount of weight that you can safely do one time. There's a non-threatening way to determine that. Then divide your base period into 3 even periods. So if it's a 12-week base, that's 3 periods of 4 weeks each. You're going to be going twice a week during those different sections. And you're going to be doing different types of progression work during those 3 periods. Only exercises that directly affect the cycling motion, such as squats, such as leg presses. And you can Google other specific things like that if you want to get into that, if you don't want to look at 3x25 as my program. So for your first period of 4 weeks, no effort, no strain, high reps, 20 to 30 reps at about 40% of your 1 rep max. The reason that you're doing such easy work is to simply get your brain to recruit the proper muscle fibers in the cycling position. It is more neurological than strength building. And by the way, something that's interesting for you to know is as you continue to do this type of work, you don't add more muscle. What you do, your brain is actually utilizing more of your existing muscle fibers that are laying there during the early weeks latent. That's what the term recruiting more muscle fiber means. It's getting more of your existing muscle fiber into the game. Then you work into your second period of 4 weeks. You start to add enough weight to make it challenging for the last rep, but it should not be difficult. You should not be ripping or burning. That's not what this is about. Your third area of 4 weeks each, you're going to reduce. You're not doing 20 to 30 anymore. You're going down to 10 to 15. You're adding enough weight to make that last rep challenging, but not difficult. Now, once you go into the next phase, which we're not going to really discuss here because we're talking about winter, you go into that next phase of build phase, and then you're going to start getting into very low reps, like 6 to 8 reps with very high weight. So experiencing some of the burn and some of the rip is going to happen there. Twice a week during base, once a week at start of race season. I encourage you to consider doing this throughout the year. But if you're, young and strapping, 25 to 35 or so, and you're doing a high race load schedule, then you may be able to eliminate, and you're male, you may want to eliminate lifting weights in the gym throughout the season. All right, getting down to the end here, on your own, what are those intangibles? We've covered a lot, and there's so much more I wish I could go into, but it's 7 minutes prior to an hour at this point. So other considerations is recovery. I already mentioned how other coaches that I speak with like to kvetch about how we have a hard time getting our athletes to take it easy during the winter months. They just want to go in and start going too hard too soon. So one of the things that any coach is going to do is they lay out a plan for you, is that every 4th week or every 3rd week, if you're over 40, or depending on how new you are, we're going to build in less volume. Same intensity, less volume. So if 8 hours a week is what you can do, starting now to lay out some structured training, then during that recovery week, every 4th week or every 3rd week, then you're still going to work with the same intensity, but instead of 8 hours, we may cut it back to 5.5 or maybe 6 hours. The intensity of your workouts will be exactly the same. You've got to give your body an opportunity to build. It's as I say in one of my videos on Start Confident, sleep and recovery is where the magic happens. That's where your body actually builds and gets the adaptation. Protein post-effort, absolutely crucial when you're doing things like stomps and hill repeats. You want protein and you want healthy carbs, not sugar. So as far as how much protein is enough protein, 4/10 of a kilogram, 4/10 of a gram per kilogram. What it kind of works out to for most people is about 30 grams of carbs. So read the labels on the back of whatever your particular supplements are. If you're doing the chocolate milk thing, it kind of comes down to 2 cups of chocolate milk. But I ask you to be careful about the sugars. You do want healthy carbs. My favorite healthy carb is sweet potatoes. Microwave a sweet potato, throw a pat of butter on there and a little bit of salt, and it's amazingly filling. The carbs are a naturally burning carb. Do that and a protein shake, and life is good, and your body's going to get good recovery. What is it about zone 2.5 you don't understand? I look at this is an encouragement to keep it easy and look for that efficiency, that plateau that I encourage you to look for. You're not looking to time trial for 2 hours or 2.5 hours. It's building too much intensity in too fast. Linear progression is what you want to see. Week upon week upon week. If you have only a heart rate monitor and you're looking at your times, then for that 2.5, that 2-hour ride that you do every Sunday, then you should see a linear progression, a little bit faster after about 10 weeks. That's when you know you're doing it right. So don't be a January star. What's going to happen is if you start peaking and just crushing it in January, then when March and April comes and the races really start to matter, you're going to get burnt out. You're going to get tired. Training is not going to be fun. All right, let's review. We covered a heck of a lot in the last hour. Here's our recap. Define your goal event. Define its key characteristics. Try to figure out where the selection, that pivotal moment in the race, is most likely to happen, built upon the key characteristics of the course. Determine where your strengths and your weaknesses are, and then look at your weaknesses and compare it to that area on that key race where the selection is going to happen. And that weakness is your uber weakness. That's your limiter, and that's what you're going to want to start honing during your base period in. Hone the base period to focus on prepping the limiter for later intensity. When you start cramming in those hard intervals, that's where you're going to want to do your work. Set your schedule up. 8 hours minimum is what I recommend. And remember, as I talk, those long rides on the weekend take a tremendous amount out of it. So you're not doing 2-hour workouts every day and then going and slamming, 4 hours on the weekend. You don't have to do that. Your long ride should equal your goal event time. Again, base riding, the goal for base riding, plateaued efficiency. Doesn't have to take forever to get there when you're watching your average speed with heart rate, or if you're fortunate enough to have a power meter, you should see that begin to rise if you are consistent with your zone 2, 2.5. Finally, your strength, train your cycling specific muscles, and as I showed you with a 3-phase approach, it should be an easy progression. Folks, that's what I had to show you. That's my dogs and my ponies today, and I hope that I didn't bore the daylights out of you, and that you found the information